Stephen Miller, a billionaire Wall Street executive, childless and tired of working, pretended to be broke on the eve of Christmas to see who in the family would inherit his business. And he never imagined that. What will Stephen discover by pretending he's lost everything? Who in his family truly cares about him? And who's just after his fortune? Don't miss this story full of surprises until the very end. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching the video from. And don't forget to subscribe. Stephen Miller leaned against the cool metal rail of his penthouse balcony, a solitary figure silhouetted against the vibrant tapestry of Manhattan's skyline. The city sprawled beneath him, a labyrinth of flickering lights and bustling streets, alive with the frenetic energy of the holiday season. Yet, as he surveyed the scene, he felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness wash over him, a disquieting void that no amount of wealth could fill. His gaze drifted to the shimmering lights decorating the buildings, a stark contrast to the darkness he felt within. At 35, Stephen had everything one could dream of: a successful career as a Wall Street executive, a sprawling penthouse with breathtaking views, and a bank account that could easily drown in zeros. But despite the opulence that surrounded him, he was ensnared in a web of superficiality that suffocated his spirit. The laughter of partygoers echoed from the lavish gathering inside, but he felt more like a ghost haunting his own life, invisible to those who surrounded him. Another Christmas, another facade, he muttered under his breath, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. The crisp December air was refreshing, yet it did little to clear the fog of discontent clouding his mind. He thought of the countless gatherings filled with hollow conversations, where relatives exchanged pleasantries that masked their true intentions. It was a charade he was tired of playing. He had worked tirelessly to reach the pinnacle of his career, sacrificing personal relationships for professional accolades. Yet now, standing amidst the wealth he had accumulated, he questioned what it all meant. Did his family truly care for him, or were they merely vultures circling his fortune? The thought gnawed at him, stirring a mixture of anger and sadness that he could no longer ignore. As he watched the snowflakes begin to fall softly, he recalled last year's Christmas gathering. The conversations had revolved around investments, inheritances, and the latest luxury goods. Instead of warmth and connection, he had felt a palpable tension in the air, a competitiveness masked by forced smiles. "Oh, Stephen, you must invest in this," his cousin Jessica had chirped, her eyes glinting with dollar signs. "It's the perfect opportunity." He shook his head, pushing the memory aside. The superficiality of those interactions had left him feeling more isolated than ever. He had longed for authenticity, for genuine connections that transcended the materialistic values that seemed to dominate his family. With a heavy sigh, Stephen stepped back inside, shutting the balcony doors behind him. The warmth of the room enveloped him, but it did little to lift the chill in his heart. The gathering was in full swing, laughter and music swirling around him, yet he felt like an outsider looking in. "Stephen, come join us," his sister Lydia called, her voice bright and cheerful. She was nestled among a group of relatives, all sipping champagne and engaging in animated conversation. He forced a smile, but inside, he felt the weight of his discontent pressing down on him. "Yeah, I'll be there in a minute," he replied, his voice lacking enthusiasm. He could already hear snippets of their discussions, the way they eagerly speculated about his financial status and their claims on his fortune. When he finally decides to settle down, "I bet he'll want to buy us all gifts," he heard his uncle say, his tone dripping with expectation. With each passing moment, the allure of the life he had built felt more like a gilded cage. He was tired of being a pawn in a game he no longer wished to play. As he settled into the plush armchair, he observed the animated discussions, the way his relatives laughed too loudly and spoke too quickly, their eyes darting toward the door as if waiting for someone to make an announcement about his wealth. "Stephen," Lydia said, her voice piercing through his reverie, "what are your plans for the new year? Any big investments lined up?" He glanced at her, noting the eager glint in her eyes, the expectation that he would unveil some lucrative opportunity that would benefit them. "I'm still figuring things out," he replied carefully, his voice steady. "It's been a busy year." "Busy?" Jessica interjected, her tone teasing, or just busy counting your millions? The laughter that followed felt hollow, and Stephen's stomach twisted uncomfortably. As the night wore on, the conversations continued to revolve around wealth and material aspirations. Stephen felt himself retreating further into the recesses of his mind, a growing determination sparking within him. He needed to escape this life, a life where love felt transactional and relationships hinged on what he could provide. Late that night, when the laughter subsided and the guests began to filter out, Stephen found himself alone in his penthouse. The silence was almost deafening, but it provided the clarity he craved. He moved to his desk, the glow of the computer screen illuminating his face as he began to draft a plan. What if I could find out who truly cares for me? He pondered aloud, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The idea of faking his bankruptcy began to take shape in his mind, a radical departure from the life he had been living. He envisioned the freedom it would bring, the opportunity to see his family's true colors, to uncover the genuine connections he had been yearning for. He could imagine it now, canceling his credit cards, selling off his luxury items, and slipping away from the gilded cage he had built for himself. The thought ignited a spark of excitement within him, a thrill he hadn't felt in ages. Who would stick around? He mused, the corners of his lips twitching into a tentative smile. Would they come to my aid, or would they vanish like smoke? As he drafted his plan, he felt a sense of liberation swelling inside him. This could be the beginning of something new, a chance to redefine his relationships and discover what really mattered in life. He scribbled down his ideas, the words flowing from his mind like water, the promise of authenticity beckoning him forward into uncharted territory. The clock ticked softly in the background, each passing minute a reminder of the bold step he was preparing to take. For the first time in years, Stephen felt a glimmer of hope, a flicker of possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a path that led him away from the shadows of his wealth and into the light of genuine connection. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the city that had once seemed so bright and vibrant, but now felt like a mere reflection of his internal struggle. The stars twinkled above, and for the first time, he felt like he could reach for them, not as a billionaire executive, but as a man seeking truth and authenticity. Tomorrow, he whispered to himself, determination lacing his voice. Tomorrow, everything changes. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of his modest Brooklyn apartment, Stephen Miller stirred awake, a twinge of uncertainty gnawing at him. The stark contrast between his former life and his current reality was staggering. Gone were the plush silk sheets and the opulent surroundings of his penthouse. He now lay on a worn mattress, enveloped in the familiar scent of old wood and the faint aroma of coffee wafting from the small cafe across the street. He glanced around, taking in the sparse furnishings. A second-hand table, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a small television that seemed more decorative than functional. This was a far cry from the extravagance he had once called home, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom creeping in. It was as if he had shed a layer of skin, one that had weighed him down with expectations and superficial relationships. Shaking off the remnants of sleep, Stephen threw on a hoodie and stepped outside. The brisk air hit him like a wave, invigorating and sharp. As he walked down the tree-lined street, he observed the world around him with new eyes. The laughter of children playing in the park, the chatter of neighbors greeting each other, and the distant sound of a street musician strumming a guitar. All of it made him feel alive. He realized that he had been missing out on the simple joys of life, overshadowed by his relentless pursuit of wealth. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the previous day. He turned the corner and spotted a diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "Open 24 hours." The place was small and cozy, a far cry from the exclusive restaurants he used to frequent. As he stepped inside, the warmth enveloped him, and he was greeted by the enticing scent of bacon and eggs sizzling on the griddle. "Hey there. Sit anywhere you like," a cheerful voice called out from behind the counter. A young woman with bright eyes and a welcoming smile wiped her hands on her apron as she approached him. "Thanks," Stephen replied, taking a seat at the counter. He could feel her gaze on him, assessing, curious. There was something refreshing about her demeanor, nothing forced or rehearsed. "What can I get for you?" she asked, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Just a simple breakfast. Eggs and toast." "Please," he said, looking down at the menu as if it were a foreign object. Coming right up. "I'm Sarah, by the way." She introduced herself, her voice warm and friendly. "Stephen," he replied, feeling oddly at ease. It was a name he had worn for years, but today it felt different, less like a title of power and more like a reflection of his genuine self. As Sarah moved around the diner, Stephen observed her interactions with the other customers. She treated everyone with the same kindness, a smile for the grumpy old man in the corner, a playful banter with the couple on a date. He couldn't help but admire her ability to make others feel valued, something he had lost sight of in his previous life. After a few minutes, she returned with his breakfast, placing the plate in front of him with a flourish. "Here you go. Just like Mom used to make," she said with a wink. Stephen chuckled. "I think my mom would be appalled by my cooking skills." "Don't worry, you're not alone. I'm still working on mine too," she replied, her laughter infectious. As he took his first bite, he savored the flavors that felt both nostalgic and comforting. "This is great. You really know how to cook." "Thanks. It's all about the love you put into it," she said, leaning against the counter. "So, what brings you to our little diner? You don't look like you belong in a place like this." He hesitated for a moment, pondering how much to reveal. "Just looking for a change, I guess. Trying to live a simpler life." "Good for you," she exclaimed. "It's nice to step back sometimes. Life in the fast lane can get pretty suffocating." Stephen nodded, feeling a warmth spread in his chest. "You wouldn't believe how true that is." As they conversed, he found himself sharing bits of his life, how he had grown tired of the corporate grind and the endless chase for more. Sarah listened intently, nodding in understanding, her eyes bright with empathy. It felt liberating to speak without the weight of his wealth and status hanging over him. "What about you? What do you dream of doing?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I'm an artist at heart," she confessed, her expression shifting to one of longing. "I love painting. I always wanted to showcase my work in galleries, but it's tough to make ends meet, you know?" "I can only imagine," Stephen said, his thoughts momentarily drifting back to the lavish art pieces that adorned his former home. "But you should never give up on your dreams. They're what make life worth living." "Thanks, Stephen. That means a lot," she replied, a hint of blush creeping into her cheeks. "Maybe one day, I'll have my own gallery, and you'll be the first person I invite." "I'd like that," he said, realizing how rare it was for him to connect with someone on this level. In that moment, he felt like just another person. Not the billionaire who had everything and yet felt like he had nothing. Meanwhile, at a grand estate in Manhattan, Stephen's family had begun to notice his absence. They gathered around the opulent dining table, opulent enough to host a small army. Their voices hushed as they speculated about his whereabouts. "Have you heard from Stephen?" his cousin Rachel asked, her tone laced with concern, but her eyes glinted with something more. Anticipation, perhaps. "No, and honestly, I'm starting to worry. What if he's really in trouble?" His sister, Melissa, chimed in, though her voice betrayed a hint of disbelief. "Trouble? With that kind of money? Please," their uncle scoffed. "He's probably just off gallivanting somewhere, enjoying the high life, or trying to hide from us," Rachel suggested, her expression becoming more animated. "What if he's trying to figure out how to protect his assets? Maybe he's faking it. You know, like that bankruptcy rumor?" Melissa added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "What if he's trying to see who really cares about him?" "Who cares?" their uncle interjected, leaning back in his chair. "As long as he's got our names on his will, we're fine." As they continued to discuss Stephen's absence, their conversation veered into a discussion about inheritances and what they might stand to gain. The air thickened with unspoken tension as they acknowledged the looming possibility that their lavish lifestyles could be at risk. Back in Brooklyn, Stephen was blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing among his family. He was lost in conversation with Sarah, who was now sharing her own dreams and aspirations with an ease that made him feel lighter. "Sometimes, I think about what it would be like to have a gallery in Paris," she mused, her eyes sparkling with excitement. The idea of showcasing my work in such a romantic city makes my heart race. Paris sounds amazing, Stephen replied, captivated by her passion. You'll get there one day, I'm sure of it. Just keep believing in yourself. Thanks, Stephen. You're really sweet, she said, her smile brightening the room. I just hope I can make it work without losing myself in the process. I get that, he said, a shadow passing over his face. Sometimes, you can get so caught up in ambition that you forget what truly matters. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and as the sun began to set, painting the diner in hues of orange and pink, Stephen felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was refreshing to connect with someone who saw him for who he was, not what he had. As he finished his meal, Stephen knew that this new chapter in his life would be filled with challenges, but the prospect of authenticity and a budding friendship with Sarah made the journey ahead feel promising. As days turned into weeks, Stephen Miller found himself settling into a surprising rhythm in his new life. The modest apartment in Brooklyn, with its creaky floors and worn furniture, felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Each morning, he would wake up to the sound of the city stirring to life, the distant honks of taxis and the faint smell of fresh bagels wafting through the air. He had traded his high-rise penthouse for this unassuming space, and with each passing day, he felt the weight of his past life lift just a little. His friendship with Sarah, the waitress from the diner, blossomed into something genuine and heartwarming. She had become his anchor in this new world, offering him a glimpse into a life that was vibrant and full of dreams despite its struggles. One chilly afternoon, as they sat in a cozy corner booth of the diner, Stephen watched her animatedly describe her latest artistic endeavor, a series of paintings inspired by the hustle and bustle of the city. You know, I want to capture the energy of New York, Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with passion. It's like this living, breathing thing. Each person has a story, and I want to tell those stories through my art. Stephen leaned in, fascinated. What kind of stories do you want to tell? She paused, chewing on her bottom lip thoughtfully. The stories of struggle, hope, and resilience. The ones that often go unnoticed. Like the man who sells hot dogs on the corner, or the woman who sings on the subway. They have dreams too, you know? That's beautiful, he replied, feeling a stirring in his heart. You have such a gift for seeing the world that way. Sarah shrugged, a blush creeping onto her cheeks. I just want to make people feel something. Art should do that, right? It should connect us. Their conversations were peppered with laughter and deep discussions that often lasted for hours. Stephen found solace in her presence, a stark contrast to the superficiality that had surrounded him for so long. He began to share bits of his own life, carefully omitting the details of his riches and the family that had grown distant over the years. One evening, they were walking through a park adorned with twinkling Christmas lights, the air crisp and filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts. Stephen took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in ages. Sarah, can I ask you something? Of course, she replied, her hands tucked into her coat pockets as she looked up at him. What do you think about family? What do you think it means to have a family? His voice was contemplative, the question heavy with unspoken emotion. Her expression turned serious. Family can be complicated. Sometimes it's the ones who are supposed to love you unconditionally that hurt you the most. But it can also be a source of strength. I think it's about the people who are there for you, no matter what. Not just by blood, but by choice. Stephen felt a pang in his chest. Her words resonated deeply within him, echoing the turmoil he had been grappling with since he had decided to fake his bankruptcy. He was estranged from his own family, tied together by wealth and obligation rather than genuine love and support. I envy you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. You have such clarity. Thanks, she said, her gaze softening. But I think everyone has a little confusion about family. It's normal. As they continued their walk, Stephen's heart felt heavy with the burden of his secret. He wanted to share everything with Sarah, the truth about his life, the reason he was living in Brooklyn, and how he felt about her. But the fear of losing the only authentic connection he had ever experienced held him back. Meanwhile, back in Manhattan, a storm was brewing among his relatives. They had gathered to discuss their concerns about Stephen's financial situation. Whispers of betrayal and greed echoed in the lavish living room of his family's estate, the air thick with tension. "Did you hear he's been living in Brooklyn?" his cousin, Melissa, remarked, a sneer curling on her lips. "I always knew he was too proud to ask for help. He's probably just trying to make a scene. What if he's actually broke?" Another relative chimed in, concern laced with opportunism. "We need to figure out how to handle this before anyone else finds out. I mean, what if he's trying to hide something from us?" Their voices were a cacophony of self-interest, each relative more concerned about their own inheritance than about Stephen's well-being. He stood in the shadows, his heart racing as he listened to their conversations. The anger bubbling within him was mixed with profound sadness. This was the family he had once adored, but now they felt like strangers, more interested in his downfall than in his happiness. As he slipped away from the gathering, Stephen's thoughts turned back to Sarah. He needed to see her, to escape the suffocating grasp of his family's greed and find solace in her warmth. That evening, he found himself in the diner, sitting at their usual booth. The smell of coffee and the sound of clinking dishes welcomed him home. Sarah approached with a radiant smile, her apron dusted with flour. "Hey, you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay?" she asked, concern flashing in her eyes. Stephen forced a smile, but the weight of his family's words lingered in his mind. "Just the usual family drama," he replied, trying to keep his tone light. "Family can be rough," she said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Want to talk about it?" He hesitated, the truth teetering on the edge of his tongue. But instead of sharing his burdens, he found himself drawn to her optimism. "Not right now. I want to hear more about your paintings. How's the one with the subway singer coming along?" Her face lit up, and for a moment, the darkness surrounding his thoughts faded. "Oh, it's coming together beautifully. I've been experimenting with colors to get the right mood. You know, the energy of the city really comes alive in that piece." As they discussed her art, Stephen felt a sense of hope blooming within him. Sarah was a light in the darkness, a reminder of what mattered most: authentic connections, dreams, and the pursuit of happiness. He realized that regardless of his past, he had the power to shape his future. The thought brought a smile to his face, a genuine one that reached his eyes. But even as he found comfort in their conversation, the shadows of his family's greed loomed large in the background, ready to shatter the fragile peace he had built. The soft glow of the streetlights illuminated the quiet streets of Brooklyn as Stephen Miller walked back to his modest apartment after yet another day of navigating his new life. The chill of the December air nipped at his cheeks, but it felt refreshing, a reminder of the reality he had chosen. Life as a broke man was challenging, yet he found unexpected comfort in the simplicity of it all. The smell of coffee and baked goods wafted through the air as he passed by Sarah's diner, where he had spent countless evenings in the warmth of her company. Inside, Sarah was wiping down the counter, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, a few strands framing her face. She looked up and smiled as he entered, the kind of smile that made the room feel a little brighter. "Hey you, just in time for some fresh coffee," she called out, pouring him a cup before he had even reached the counter. "Thanks, Sarah. You're a lifesaver," Stephen replied, taking a seat at the counter. As he sipped the coffee, the heat seeped into his hands, grounding him in the moment. "So, what's on the agenda tonight?" "More of the same," he asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "Pretty much. But I'm thinking of trying a new recipe for the dessert special tomorrow. Something festive," she said, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "What do you think? Should I go for peppermint or gingerbread?" "Gingerbread sounds perfect for this time of year. It has that warm, cozy feel to it," he suggested, leaning in closer. Their conversations had become a refuge for him, a stark contrast to the hollow exchanges he endured with his family. "Gingerbread it is then," she exclaimed, jotting it down on a notepad. "You know, I've always dreamed of opening my own bakery one day, but I never had the resources to make it happen." Stephen's heart ached at her words. He wanted to tell her that he understood, that he had once been consumed by the same dreams of success and wealth, yet here he was, discovering a newfound appreciation for the simple things. You should go for it, Sarah. You have a talent for this. And who knows, maybe one day you'll be famous for your gingerbread, he said, trying to encourage her. A hint of shyness crossed her face as she laughed lightly. Maybe, but I'd need to find investors or partners, and that's a whole other challenge. You never know. The right people might just come into your life when you least expect it, Stephen replied, feeling a strange sense of hope blossom within him. He hadn't felt this way in years, and it was exhilarating. Speaking of partners, how's your business venture going? She asked, her expression turning more serious. I mean, it must be tough starting over. He hesitated, considering how much he should reveal. It's definitely been an adjustment, he said, his voice slightly strained. But I'm learning a lot about myself and what really matters. It's refreshing in a way. I can only imagine, she said softly. It's brave of you to take that step. Most people would just cling to what they have. Yeah, well, I guess I was tired of living a lie, he admitted, his thoughts drifting to the upcoming confrontation with his family. They were still convinced of his financial downfall, and he had no idea how far they would go to manipulate him. Hey, you okay? Sarah asked, noticing the shift in his demeanor. Yeah, just thinking about family stuff, he replied, forcing a smile. You know how it goes. Family can be complicated, she said, her eyes reflecting understanding. I sometimes wish I had a bigger family. It gets lonely sometimes. Lonely? Stephen echoed, feeling a pang in his chest. I used to think having a big family was everything, but sometimes it's just noise. You can feel isolated even in a crowded room. Exactly. It's the quality of the connections that matter, not the quantity, she said, her voice passionate. Those real connections are what make life rich. He couldn't help but admire her perspective. It was refreshing and so different from the conversations he had with his relatives. You're right about that, he replied. It's about finding the people who truly care. As they talked, Stephen felt the weight of his secret pressing heavily on him. With every moment spent with Sarah, he found himself wanting to share more of himself, to let her in on the truth of who he was. But how could he tell her that he was playing a part, that he had orchestrated this facade to test the very bonds they discussed? The diner began to fill with the sounds of other patrons, laughter, and clinking silverware, but for Stephen, it felt like they were in their own world. So, any plans for Christmas? He asked, trying to steer the conversation to lighter topics. Just the usual, she said with a dismissive wave. I'll probably work a shift or two, and then maybe spend some time with a couple of friends. Nothing fancy. Friends are important, he said. You should cherish those moments. Yeah, I just wish I had someone special to share it with, she said wistfully, her gaze drifting as if she were imagining a different scenario. Stephen's heart raced at her words, a part of him wanting to reach across the counter and tell her that she wasn't alone, that he wanted to be that person for her. But the fear of revealing his true identity held him back. You never know what might happen. The holidays have a way of bringing unexpected surprises. True, she replied, her smile returning. Maybe this year will be different. Just then, the door swung open, and a familiar voice called out, breaking their moment. Stephen, there you are. It was his cousin, Mark, striding into the diner with an air of confidence that made Stephen's stomach churn. Mark, he said, forcing a smile as his cousin approached. What are you doing here? I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd check on you. Heard you've been going through a tough time, Mark said, his tone dripping with feigned concern. How's everything holding up? Just trying to get by, Stephen replied, noting the glint in Mark's eyes. He could sense the underlying motives. It was all too clear. Good to hear, Mark said, glancing at Sarah, who was now standing behind the counter, her expression shifting from friendly to cautious. And who's this? Just a friend, Stephen replied, a protective instinct rising within him. Ah, a friend, Mark echoed, his voice tinged with skepticism. Well, Stephen, you know family is important, especially during the holidays. We're all worried about you. Maybe you should come back home for Christmas. We can help you get back on your feet. Stephen's heart raced at the implication. Thanks, but I'm fine here. Are you sure? You'd be surprised how much we can help you if you let us, Mark said, his voice smooth as silk, but Stephen could hear the subtle pressure beneath it. I appreciate it, but I think I need some time to figure things out on my own, Stephen replied firmly, locking eyes with Mark, refusing to back down. Suit yourself, Mark said, a smirk creeping onto his face. But don't say I didn't offer. Family is everything, after all. With that, he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Stephen feeling unsettled. The interaction had revealed much about his cousin's intentions, and the thought of returning to his family felt more suffocating than ever. Sorry about that, Stephen said, turning back to Sarah, who was watching him intently. Family can be a lot, huh? She said, her voice gentle. Yeah, you could say that, he replied, running a hand through his hair. But I'm really grateful for this place, for you. It's different. Different can be good, she said, her smile returning, and for a moment, the weight of his deception felt lighter. As they continued to talk, Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that the confrontation with his family was looming closer, and the tension he felt in his heart began to mix with a gathering storm of emotions. He knew he had to prepare for what was coming, but in the warmth of Sarah's presence, he found a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could redefine what family truly meant. As the snow continued to fall softly outside, blanketing the city in a gentle white hue, Stephen sat in his modest Brooklyn apartment, the warmth of a single lamp illuminating the otherwise dim room. He stared blankly at the wall, lost in thought. Guilt began to gnaw at him like a persistent ache. He had come to cherish the connection he had formed with Sarah, the waitress from the diner who had shown him a kindness he hadn't experienced in years. But with each passing day, the weight of his deception pressed heavier on his conscience. How could he continue to lie to her, especially when his feelings for her had deepened into something genuine and profound? He remembered their last conversation, how they had talked late into the night, sharing dreams and fears over steaming cups of coffee. Sarah had opened up about her aspirations of becoming an artist, her eyes shining with passion. In return, he had shared bits and pieces of his life, carefully curated tales of struggle that avoided the truth of his wealth. But now, as he sat alone, he realized that the truth was a barrier he had erected between them. He couldn't keep pretending to be someone he wasn't, especially not with someone who had come to mean so much to him. As the clock ticked on the wall, Stephen's resolve began to waver. He needed to tell Sarah the truth, not just for her sake, but for his own. He had never felt this way about anyone before, and the idea of losing her because of his lies was unbearable. But how would she react? Would she feel betrayed? Would she see him as just another rich man, hiding behind a facade of deception? His phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. It was a message from Sarah, inviting him to a family gathering at her place. It's just a small get-together, she had written. I'd love for you to come. My family wants to meet the guy who makes me smile. A wave of anxiety washed over him. He wanted nothing more than to see her, but the thought of being around people who might judge him once they learned the truth was daunting. Still, he couldn't say no. Not when he was finally beginning to understand the beauty of real connections. He typed a quick response, agreeing to join. The following evening, Stephen found himself standing at the door of Sarah's family home, feeling both excited and terrified. The laughter and chatter of people filled the air as he stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around him like a cozy blanket. Sarah was in the kitchen, and as she turned and spotted him, her face lit up with delight. "Stephen, you made it!" she exclaimed, rushing over to him. She enveloped him in a hug, and for a moment, he felt a sense of belonging that had eluded him for years. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied, trying to sound casual, though his heart raced. As they mingled with her family, Stephen was struck by the contrast between this gathering and his own family's gatherings. Here, there was laughter, genuine affection, and warmth. Sarah introduced him to her parents, her siblings, and even her quirky aunt, who immediately began to question him about his hobbies. "What do you do for fun, Stephen?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "Oh, just the usual stuff," he evaded, feeling the familiar tug of discomfort. "I like to read and walk around the city." "Just the usual?" Sarah chimed in, teasingly. "He's being modest. He's a great cook too. Really? Her mother said, raising an eyebrow. You'll have to show us your skills sometime. He chuckled nervously, but the warmth of their interest was intoxicating. He felt himself relaxing as they engaged in light-hearted banter, but in the back of his mind, the truth loomed like a dark cloud, threatening to overshadow the joy he felt in the moment. As the evening progressed, Stephen found a moment alone with Sarah on the balcony, the cool air nipping at their cheeks. The city lights twinkled like stars in the distance, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. "Thank you for inviting me," he said, leaning against the railing. "Your family is amazing." She smiled, her eyes bright. "I'm glad you're here. It means a lot to me." The sincerity in her voice tugged at his heart, and he knew he couldn't hold back any longer. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you." Before he could continue, the sound of laughter broke through their moment. Stephen turned to see her cousin, Jake, sauntering outside, a cocky grin plastered on his face. "Hey, you two lovebirds," Jake called out, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What are you plotting out here? Planning a grand escape?" "Just enjoying the view," Sarah shot back, rolling her eyes. Jake stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Stephen. "So, what do you do for a living?" Must be something fancy to catch Sarah's eye. Stephen hesitated, the question sending a jolt of anxiety through him. "I'm in finance," he said cautiously. Jake's grin widened. "Ah, a money guy. No wonder you're so charming. Just watch out for family, man. They can be sharks when they smell blood in the water." Stephen felt a chill run down his spine at Jake's words, an unsettling reminder of the familial greed he was trying to escape. "I'll keep that in mind," he replied, forcing a smile. As Jake turned to head back inside, Stephen felt a sense of foreboding settle in. He knew his cousin well enough to recognize the predatory glint in his eyes. It was the same look that had been present at every family gathering, the ever-present undercurrent of competition and jealousy. Later that evening, the atmosphere shifted as the family gathered around the dining table, filled with delicious food and laughter. Stephen tried to immerse himself in the warmth, but Jake's earlier words echoed in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. After dinner, as the family moved to the living room for dessert, Stephen found himself cornered by Jake, who leaned in closer, his voice low and conspiratorial. "You know, Stephen, I've been hearing some interesting things about your financial situation. You sure you're okay? You wouldn't want to put your family in a bind, would you?" The implication hung heavy in the air, and Stephen's heart raced. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Oh, come on. We all know how these things go. If you're in trouble, I could help you out. Just sign over a few things, and we can make it all go away." Jake's smirk was unsettling, and Stephen felt a surge of anger rise within him. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm fine," he replied, his tone firm. "Right. Just remember, family looks out for each other. You wouldn't want to be the one left out, would you?" As Jake sauntered away, Stephen's heart sank. The betrayal felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Here he was, surrounded by people who claimed to care about him, and yet there was Jake, ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. Later that night, as the family festivities began to wind down, Stephen found Sarah alone in a quiet corner, her eyes shining with warmth and concern. "Hey, you okay? You seem a little off." He took a deep breath, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. "Yeah, just family stuff, I guess." She stepped closer, her hand gently touching his arm. "You can talk to me, you know. I'm here for you." In that moment, Stephen felt the urge to confess swell within him. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, the sound of laughter erupted from the living room, shattering the intimacy of their moment. He hesitated, feeling torn. He wanted to share everything with Sarah, his past, his struggles, his plans. But the fear of her reaction loomed large. What if she couldn't accept the truth? What if she saw him as just another entitled rich man? As he looked into her eyes, he knew he had to make a choice. The weight of his deception felt unbearable, but revealing his true identity would mean exposing not only his wealth but the family dynamics he had tried so hard to escape. "Sarah," he finally said, his voice trembling slightly, There's something I need to tell you about who I really am." But before he could continue, her family called her name, drawing her away. As she turned to answer, Stephen's heart sank. The moment had slipped through his fingers, leaving him with a sense of impending doom. He knew he had to come clean, but as he watched Sarah walk away, he felt the walls of his deception closing in. Would he ever be able to find the right moment to tell her? And when he did, would it destroy the connection they had built? The uncertainty gnawed at him, amplifying his fear of loss and the painful truth he had hidden for so long. As the cold wind whipped through the streets of Brooklyn, Stephen Miller stood outside the diner, his heart racing. He had spent the last few weeks wrapped in a web of deceit, and now, just as he was about to confess everything to Sarah, he found himself frozen in place. The warmth of the diner beckoned him, but he was caught in a moment of hesitation, burdened by the weight of his lies. He turned and leaned against the cold brick wall, listening intently as his cousin, Mark, and Aunt Linda approached from around the corner. Their voices carried through the chilly air, words laced with malice and greed. "He thinks he can just walk away with everything," Mark sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Once we're done with him, he'll be begging us to take him back. Just wait until he finds out what we have planned. He'll be out of the picture for good," Aunt Linda replied, her tone conspiratorial. "We can't let him ruin our family legacy." Stephen's heart sank as he heard the venomous plotting of his own flesh and blood. They were discussing him as if he were nothing more than a pawn in their game, a mere obstacle to be removed. His initial resolve to confess to Sarah was replaced by a surge of anger. He could no longer stand idly by while they schemed against him. With clenched fists and determination coursing through him, Stephen pushed himself off the wall and entered the diner. The familiar scent of coffee and pancakes enveloped him, but he barely noticed. He spotted Sarah behind the counter, her smile brightening the dreary day. She was animatedly chatting with a customer, her laughter ringing like music in his ears. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, to shield her from the toxic reality of his family. "Hey, Stephen," Sarah called, her eyes sparkling. "You're just in time for the special. It's a holiday treat today, gingerbread pancakes." He forced a smile, but his heart raced with the knowledge of the betrayal he had just overheard. "Sounds amazing, Sarah, but I need to talk to you about something important." Her expression shifted from joy to concern as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Is everything all right? You look a bit intense." He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. "Can we step outside for a moment? It's about my family." "Of course," she replied, her brow furrowing. "Let me just tell Marge I'll be taking a quick break." Once outside, the chilly air hit him like a wave, but he was determined to be honest with her. "Sarah, I've been hiding something from you. I'm not who you think I am. I'm not broke. I'm actually a billionaire. I faked my bankruptcy to see who really cares about me." Sarah's eyes widened, and for a moment, silence stretched between them. "You're a billionaire?" She shook her head, disbelief etched on her features. "Why would you do something like that?" "I was tired of the superficiality, tired of my family's greed. I thought if I pretended to be struggling, I could find out who truly cared about me," he explained, his voice heavy with the weight of his confession. "But what about us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did you think I—" "No," he interrupted, his heart racing. "I never meant to deceive you. You're the only person who's treated me like a real human being. I care about you, Sarah, more than I ever thought possible." Before she could respond, the front door of the diner swung open, and Mark stepped out, a smug expression on his face. Well, if it isn't the prodigal son and his little waitress," he taunted, glancing between them. "What a touching moment." "Mark," Stephen said, his voice low and steady. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see how my dear cousin was holding up. Heard things weren't going so well for you," Mark sneered, stepping closer. "But it looks like you've found a little distraction." "Leave her out of this," Stephen warned, stepping protectively in front of Sarah, who looked visibly shaken by Mark's presence. "Oh, I think not. She's part of the problem now," Mark continued, a glint of malice in his eyes. "You think you can just waltz away with the family fortune? You're going to pay for this, Stephen. We won't let you ruin everything we've worked for. Stephen's blood boiled. You're the ones ruining everything. You don't care about family. You only care about money and power. I won't let you manipulate me or anyone else ever again. Is that a threat? Mark laughed mockingly. What are you going to do? You're nothing without your money. Just a washed-up executive playing pretend. As Mark stepped closer, Stephen felt a surge of courage. I'm done playing pretend. I'm going to confront my family, and I'm going to expose everything. I'll show them who they really are. Mark's facade faltered for a moment, and Stephen seized the opportunity. You think this is a game? I'm not afraid of you or your schemes anymore. With that, Stephen turned to Sarah, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes. I need you by my side for this. You're the only person I trust. Stephen, she hesitated, her voice shaking. I don't know what to believe anymore. Just trust me, he implored, reaching for her hand. Together, we can face them. They need to see the truth. As he looked into her eyes, he could see the flicker of uncertainty, but also the glimmer of hope. Okay, she finally replied, her voice firm. I'm with you. With renewed resolve, they walked back into the diner, the warmth of the inside contrasting sharply with the icy reality they were about to face. Stephen's heart raced as he prepared to confront his family, the stakes higher than ever. He could no longer hide in the shadows. It was time to step into the light and reclaim his life. Later that evening, the family gathered in the lavish living room of the Miller estate, a space filled with opulence but devoid of warmth. The air was thick with tension, whispers of betrayal swirling around like a storm cloud. Stephen stood in the doorway, his heart pounding as he took in the sight of his relatives, who were oblivious to the truth that was about to shatter their world. Why are we even waiting for him? Aunt Linda asked, her impatience evident. He's probably busy wallowing in his misery. Let's give him a chance to explain, Mark replied, his voice smooth and condescending. He might just be too ashamed to show his face. Stephen stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. I'm here, he said, his voice unwavering. And I have something important to say. Gasps filled the room as all eyes turned to him. I'm not broke, he continued, feeling the weight of their scrutiny. I faked my bankruptcy to find out who truly cares about me, and what I discovered was shocking. What are you talking about? His father demanded, disbelief etched on his face. I heard you scheming, Mark. Stephen shot back, his voice rising. You think I'm just some fool you can manipulate? You've been plotting to take me down, to take everything from me. Aunt Linda's face turned pale, and the room erupted into chaos. You're out of your mind, she shouted. But Stephen pressed on, fueled by a mix of anger and relief. I'm done being treated like a pawn in your game. You talk about family, but all you care about is money and power. You don't care about me or anyone else. As he spoke, he glanced at Sarah, who stood resolutely beside him, her presence grounding him. But I'm not alone anymore. Sarah has shown me what it means to care for someone without ulterior motives. Together, we're going to reclaim what's rightfully mine. The room fell silent, the tension palpable as his family processed the weight of his words. Mark's expression twisted in rage, but Stephen stood firm, ready to fight for his truth. Just then, Sarah stepped forward, her voice strong and unwavering. I'm not just any waitress. I'm the daughter of a man your family wronged. I know the truth about your business practices and the lives you've destroyed. Together, Stephen and I will make things right. Gasps echoed through the room, and for the first time, the facade of respectability began to crack. The Miller family was forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Their greed laid bare before them. As they faced the fallout of their deception, Stephen felt a surge of liberation. He was no longer the man trapped by his wealth. He was a man with purpose, standing beside the one person who had seen him for who he truly was. Together, they would forge a new path, united in love and justice. The storm that had threatened to engulf him now transformed into a beacon of hope, illuminating a future filled with authenticity and connection. As he took Sarah's hand, he knew that their journey was just beginning, but this time, they would face it together.